The past 2 years have clearly been the most surreal and challenging of our lives. And I believe history will expose the period as the greatest ever deception committed on mankind. Hopefully, some of the things I'm going to talk about as a former journalist of nearly 40 years' experience will give a greater insight into how this collective madness and crimes against humanity were able to happen. First, I would say that this perfect storm was many years in the gestation and could not have happened even a decade ago. We needed the added ingredients of deepening political correctness, wokeism, virtue signalling, excessive health and safety measures, and a paralysing fear of litigation, as well as other factors that I will come to. They all guaranteed that many of those who initially suspected that the Emperor may not be wearing any clothes kept their mouths shut. And after months of unrelenting propaganda and psychological abuse, many came to even convince themselves that the naked skin was indeed a reasonable form of dress. We saw a world swept along in a mass formation psychosis brought on by a relentless terror campaign which maintained a heightened state of fear and robbed a majority of people of their capacity for critical thinking. Early in 2020, within weeks of the start of the alleged global pandemic, I sensed something was not right. Others did too. As Neil Oliver recently observed, somewhere deep inside sensed very real danger, perhaps for the first time in our lives, and it wasn't from a virus. It also became clear as I looked around me that it was triggering nearly everyone's deepest fears in one way or another. In time, I came to see that those who were overwhelmed by that anxiety would become psychologically owned by those who were driving it. 2 years ago, the world's logic, reason, and rationale were lost to a bizarre upside-down existence, which evolved into a battle between dark and light. Vulnerable souls fell victim to dark forces. Sadly, these included many church members whose apparent faith in Christ and God was quickly found wanting. Faith in an eternal afterlife was quickly jettisoned for a grim clutching at this mortal existence. Ridiculous as it should have seemed, COVID came to be regarded by too many people as if it, and it alone, was the only threat to an everlasting life. The world became enthralled to a virus that in reality posed very little mortal threat to those healthy and under the age of 75. Faith in God, or even a simple acceptance of the inevitable circle of life and death, were no longer a source of spiritual strength. Instead, we got the cult of COVID, with government ministers and their appointed scientists as the new apostles. Minds, bodies, and souls were handed over to the mighty powers of the likes of Boris Johnson, Matt Hancock, Nicola Sturgeon, Chris Whitty, Jason Leach, and Anthony Fauci, and others who stood alongside them with the word professor or doctor before their name. Remember when we once automatically respected people called professor or doctor? Well, what a heavy price we've paid for that programming. I don't mind admitting what I witnessed in those early days of COVID really stressed me, and I could see what this relentless fear campaign was doing to people and the extreme dangers it presented to mankind. Psychologist Carl Jung had warned that mass psychosis was the greatest threat of all to humanity, and here we were in the grip of it. After decades of often pondering just how the good citizens of Germany allowed Hitler and the Nazis to do their worst, I found myself watching a display of how easily people could be taken over by propaganda, terror, and threats, and how those same people would quickly turn against a minority deemed not to be behaving in the national interest. For a while, I vented my frustration and anger with anyone who would pretend to listen. trying to tell them they were being grossly misled. That included the local minister. In the middle of the street, I let him know in a rapid-fire rant how appalled I was at the weakness of churches in meekly surrendering the right to congregate and sing and pray. I turned the air a shade of blue with that poor minister and walked away feeling much better for it. Such moments of frustration and anger at the blindness and susceptibility of others were my defiant way of staying sane in the New World Asylum. But I'm not here to have a go at churches or their members. They, like so many others, were victims of a horrendous propaganda onslaught, so harmful that no sane person could possibly claim it was in the interest of public health. And the prime villains? The very mainstream media, the very same media I had been part of, albeit at the more benign weekly newspaper level, for nearly 4 decades. The past 2 years could not have happened without the media. We can point to governments, the World Health Organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, or ruthless big pharma, or corrupted regulators, or criminally unethical behavioral scientists, or other scientists and doctors, public health officials and academics who stayed quiet out of vested interests, sheer cowardice, or just plain ignorance. We can point to police officers who became mindless and willing enforcers of the most ridiculous and cruel measures and regulations, or predictably knee-jerk trade unionists who wanted to shut down schools and everything else to protect their members. Too many teachers, we discovered, never did care about children. All of them are culpable, but they had to be allowed to act unchallenged. And they were indeed unchallenged by our traditional watchdogs in the mainstream media. The media did not just turn the other way and abandon the public. It went much further. It attacked us and it turned the screws. Here was the shepherd's faithful sheepdogs turned rogue and leading the wolves in savaging the sheep. It was a brutal betrayal on a scale that would have been previously unimaginable prior to 2020. Here was a film script so outlandish that no one would have dared written it for fear of ridicule. Here was 1984, Alice in Wonderland and Catch-22, meshed together by a Kafkaesque mind into a horrible dystopian reality. And all facilitated under the guise of a caring media led by the trusty BBC. When the COVID pantomime kicked off in earnest in March 2020, I watched the media gorge itself in fear and terror. I recognised that initial feast. It was the nature of the beast. Every journalist learns quickly that bad news sells. But in normal circumstances, truth, or at least a semblance of it, eventually kicks in. And a few months into this alleged pandemic, there was plenty of clear evidence for anyone who cared to look that this was not the bubonic plague. People were not falling like flies. Surely, I thought, the media will finally expose the charade, and common sense and proportionality will prevail. A few days or weeks of collective truth in the media by early summer 2020 would have knocked the nonsense on the head and returned us to sanity. But instead, like the governments and their cohorts, the mainstream media doubled down on the deception, omissions, exaggerations and lies. It went all in. Undoubtedly, a cash-strapped media was seduced into compliance, if it needed to be, by the hundreds of millions of pounds worth of government coronavirus advertising put its way. Newshounds were not going to bite the hand that fed them. At this point, I knew for sure that it was not a deadly virus that was running rampant through the world. Instead, it was a malevolent spirit carried by the media to cheerlead lockdowns and devastate businesses, economies, the NHS, education, our physical and mental health, and so much more. This spread of malevolence would allow all kinds of inhumane practices to be carried out in the name of public health. It would divide families and friends and incite hatred. It would dupe, blackmail, threaten and coerce billions of people into taking experimental injection that, for the best part, they never needed. It was a malevolence that would hide the many dangers of these injections and encourage the demonizing of those who dared question them. This malevolence was so infectious that even prominent church leaders would publicly condemn the injection hesitant as selfish and irresponsible, thereby inciting further hatred and division. How Christian. This was an evil that had such a grip that no greater evil was off the table, as we saw by some of the events that went on around the world. And all defended and pushed by a global mainstream media which thought it perfectly legitimate to ask, is it time to put the squeeze on the unvaccinated? In short, the media was the super spreader of evil. Back in the 1960s, human rights activist Malcolm X stated, "The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and make the guilty innocent, and that's power, because they control the mind of the masses." That was then, and the media has been on steroids since, muscling up in its dark arts. And those in power, governments, big corporations, and the moneyed elite, have come to see it as a royal road to influencing and then completely controlling human minds and behaviour. It took just 10 words on a placard at a freedom rally in London last year to encapsulate the sinister, unbelievably damaging madness of the past 2 years. And the placard read, "Did the BBC's credibility die of COVID or with COVID?" Of course, the message applies to the entire global mainstream media, but perhaps the BBC is the most culpable. After all, it still, undeservedly, hangs on to enough of its once legendary reputation of being the bastion of accuracy and truth, a responsibility all the heavier in these days of lazy, cut-and-paste journalism. Today's traditional so-called journalism is by and large worthless, has been for years. The slippery slope began in earnest with increasing listing of media companies on the stock market. The same stock market that allows the super rich to buy huge amounts of media and big pharma shares, and all the control and influence that brings, regardless of conflict of interest. In America, Pfizer is free to sponsor numerous news programs, again ensuring that hand that fed was not going to be bit. In recent decades, profitable newspaper companies were merged and new technologies allowed staff cuts to maintain or increase shareholder profits. But as we know, stock market investors always want more. More cost-cutting followed, and as a former UK media boss prophesied, fewer people did more work for less money. Staff numbers were savaged, and as the squeeze increased, the better-paid old hands took packages to get out. Why stick around when you're no longer given the time to work on a story properly? Why stick around and watch your reputation for quality, integrity, and truth being trashed? All journalists really did care about these things, and those that didn't care enough rushed to the dark side to a burgeoning and better-paid PR industry, which, of course, is all about information control. Invaluable older staff members were replaced by the young, cheap and inexperienced, and soon there was no one left or the time to show the young how to politely persist with questions until you get an answer, or show that real journalism is about fairness, truth and accuracy, that it's about upholding democratic rights and freedoms and standing up for the oppressed. The young were also much easier for management to indoctrinate and control. Gone were the days when a seasoned reporter could march into the editor's office and demand, "Why the hell are we not telling people what's going on?" and still keep his job and get the story printed. Once upon a time, a good editor was obsessed with truth, and his or her decision on what went in the paper was sacrosanct, and they took that responsibility seriously. Now it is the advertising executive, the money one, who carries sway, and that takes you into very dangerous territory. Influence and silence can clearly be bought. When I left newspapers some years ago, I felt sorry for the younger ones, increasingly stuck in a hamster wheels of oppressive work practices and mediocrity for rubbish money. Today's reporters no longer investigate. That takes time, and time is something they're not given. Today is the norm to merely regurgitate government, local authority and corporate press releases. There is little or no checking of alleged facts. Many journalists are masters of cut and paste and little else. The weekly journalists tell themselves it was in the Nationals, so it's probably true. I'll copy it and jig it around a bit. The National reporter says the same because it was previously reported by another paper or the BBC. And as we know now, the BBC no longer cares to establish the truth, but simply and arrogantly decides it. Compare today's Times or Glasgow Herald with 30 years ago, and you will be aghast at the scale of dumbing down in that period. Papers now have endless opinion columns. Does the world really need one more opinion? No, but these columns are a very useful tool in shaping the minds of readers, and we now know how easy that is. The notion that the BBC said it, so it must be true, may turn out to be the most calamitous assumption made by so many. For me and others, the mainstream media's credibility has indeed died, just like the London placard said. What remains is a highly dangerous zombie manifestation, relentlessly attacking its innocent victims, the naive, trusting public who still find it inconceivable that the BBC and the rest of the media is destroying them. Looking back, the first indication that the media body had been utterly possessed occurred in January 2020, when people were allegedly filmed in Wuhan dropping dead in the streets. This terrible virus apparently simply had to touch you and tig you were dead. Not one mainstream reporter questioned the validity of the images, establishing the do not question template for the next 2 years. There became no end to the screaming red flags ignored by the mainstream media. One man, Neil Ferguson, I refuse to call him professor, of Imperial College London, comes up with apocalyptic death toll projections, and his word alone, is taken as gospel by the world, despite his appalling track record on previous health emergencies. Long established and well-researched pandemic protocols are cast aside to instead, for the first time ever, lock down and quarantine entirely healthy populations, even after it's established that only the elderly and vulnerable are chiefly at serious risk. Disproportionate measures and restrictions are introduced with so-called scientific authority to give them substance, yet are completely contradicted with a further dose of scientific authority only weeks later. Rules are introduced whereby someone would be called a COVID death if they died of anything within 28 days of a positive PCR test, regardless of any serious long-term health issue. Cheap face masks become obligatory despite no evidence of their efficacy. Lockdowns continue despite a growing mountain of academic research showing extremely marginal upsides but enormous harms and collateral damage. And eye-watering sums of public money are spent tackling COVID without any demonstrable cost-benefit analysis or obvious result. The red flag list goes on and on. The smashing of human rights by governmental threats, coercion and bullying, and a terrifying level of serious vaccine adverse effects, all ignored by the media. The media did not simply fail to ask basic questions or defend rights. It became the vehicle through which the great lie could continue and magnify. The media terrorised and targeted. It incited hate and division. It shut down debate and censored anyone, no matter how qualified or eminent, who spoke off script. It embraced lockdowns and cheerleaded vaccines. Add in cancelled health appointments for cancer, heart and other serious conditions. And the global media's fear feast is probably responsible for the premature deaths of millions. Totally corrupted, the mainstream media will, as Malcolm X implied, continue to work to retain power for those now controlling it, believing it can maintain the narrative and manipulate the minds of the majority of people. It will continue to suppress truths that would effectively put itself in the dock for countless crimes against humanity. For some months now, distractions have been conjured up: Ukraine, the prospect of a world war, inflation, energy crisis, climate change, and so on. COVID, suddenly there's nothing to see here anymore. Move on. Everyone did their best. We just have to live with it. Worryingly, dark forces now know they control so many malleable and traumatised minds who remain incapable of discernment. I'll say this slowly to let it sink in. These dark forces know that with the mainstream media on side and a further injection of fear, they can do virtually anything they like and get away with it. So the modern-day Nazi-style propaganda machine marches on. But what about the equivalent of the ordinary German people who facilitated the Second World War and its horrors, including the thousands who turned up daily for work running concentration camps? What is the truth about the ordinary mainstream media journalists who continue to facilitate our modern-day lies and horrors? Well, a journalist friend of mine south of the border, who is fighting a dedicated, stout battle for truth from within, has just written a piece which sheds light on that very question. Here's some of what he says. I wrote an article for UK Column News more than a year ago that made allegations so strong against newspaper proprietors that if my anonymity had not been kept, I would have lost my job. I now feel the need to write this second anonymous whistleblower article. I'm doing this mainly to protect my colleagues in the mainstream media and to reveal what has really been going on in the industry and why. It won't be long before a journalist is physically hurt for their role in what happened in the COVID era. And I've already experienced some of this public hatred towards journalists, being shouted at and told I was a disgrace at a public meeting about COVID injection harm when I announced that I worked with the mainstream media. If it had not been for a senior politician who knows me, speaking up for my integrity, I would have had to have made a sharp exit for my own safety. Since that UK Column article, I've slowly become aware that many of my colleagues are not stupid, they're not controlled opposition, and they're not just being told what to write. They're under a spell of remarkable simplicity that has just two elements: censorship and propaganda, and brings about the end product of fear. Most of my colleagues are fairly low down in the editorial structure of the global mainstream monster, but they represent a microcosm of what is happening further along the corridors of power, and it goes some way to explain the absolute ignorance among those reporting the news. There are a handful of my colleagues who are aware the human race is being railroaded into a new world order controlled by technocrats. Some others are starting to realise that politicians have no problems lying to us about the most important global issues. This second group, although aware of something bad happening around them, recoil at the thought of a global conspiracy to enslave humanity. They are fearful their reputation and jobs could be harmed by discussing COVID through the lens of holding authority to account or following the money and asking who benefits. Some colleagues are also friends, and for 2 years we did not see each other face to face because mainstream media offices were shut across the country. However, recently we have been returning to our desks, allowing me to look these colleagues in the eye as I hear their thoughts about what has been going on. It has been a shocking, disheartening experience. The propaganda pumped out by the government and regurgitated by the national newspapers and television news networks has done an extremely good job of scaring them to such an extent that real psychological trauma has been caused to them. The censorship has also left them blissfully unaware of COVID counter-narratives. They truly believe in Bill Gates as a charitable benefactor for humanity. They are living in a different reality to myself and do not want to listen to those who disagree with them. Conversations end quickly because further debate would be too uncomfortable. In general, mainstream journalists are no different to those in other walks of life and build their understanding of the world from the television, radio and mainstream newspapers. Careers depend on consuming other mainstream outlets, especially so at local level where news sense is guided by what the national news is saying. So here I am, a journalist of more than 25 years' experience who has largely been unable to wake up my colleagues. I have been restricted from writing about what I know or even to ask questions of authority that my editor does not want asked. I'm not giving up, though. I'm staying here as I know things are very likely to get worse. And when they do, more of my colleagues will start waking up, and I'll be here to point them towards official documents that they will know nothing about because the national newspapers and the broadcast news have chosen to ignore them. Every one of us that resists and speaks out is like the lone mouse gnawing away at the foundations of a wooden house. Eventually, that one mouse becomes 2, and then 4, and then 8, and so on, all gnawing away until the house collapses. That is how we get out of this mess, from the bottom of whatever corporate pyramid we operate in. There is no point in hoping for change from above. As I can tell you with absolute clarity and experience, it is not coming. Journalists who I have known for years and generally respect are just as clueless about COVID now as they were at the start of 2020. Don't hate them, feel sorry for them. They too are victims in all this. So that's my friend's story and nearly the end of mine. I'm sure there's a little part in all of us that hopes that the worst of this terrible nightmare is over. Sadly, I cannot see that being the case as long as the mainstream media holds sway over the majority of minds. So what do? Well, we keep doing what we're doing, holding the faith and fighting the good fight, being another mouse gnawing away at the lies. And we must take heart from the incredible courage, character, love and spirit we have witnessed in ourselves and others in the past 2 years. And we've also discovered that we're unbreakable. And for that, I feel we're truly blessed. Thank you.